So you get three types of trend forecasters: those who really analyze current trends and make predictions, those who are so influential they make trends happen, and those that are so far out that they actually appear to live in the future world. And I think Bronwyn's a combination of all three, a fantastic hybrid with that. Bronwyn's a partner at Flux Trends. She's a long-time collaborator and a fellow trend spotter, and she brings a very unique curiosity to every aspect of the trends that we track. And specifically, her area of expertise and focus is fintech and new economic models, and especially how those relate to business trends. She's got a degree in economics from the University of London, future studies from University of Stellenbosch, and also studies in fintech and post-cash markets from the Oxford University in the UK. And on top of all of that, in her previous life, she had as a marketing background. So she looks at trends in a very, very different and a very, very unique way. So she brings big ideas and big concepts that are going to make you think very, very deeply. So hold on to your seatbelts, and Bronwyn, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dion. So as Dion's covered, like my academic background is quite diverse, but what it has in common, the intersection of marketing and economics and futures and trends, is that it all really looks at what's going on with both incentives and with trade-offs. And we're going to be talking about some of those things today, but in particular, Terry's asked me to speak about narrative economics, which is another fantastic intersection between the worlds of trends, marketing, and economics itself. So I think the first thing to talk about when it talks about narratives and stories is the question I think a lot of us have been asking, particularly people around about my age, because I am one of those unhappy millennials. I am right in the center of that generational cohort. And a lot of us have asked what's happened to the future. We were promised a whole lot of exciting things, which you can see on like the left-hand side of the screen, which would include things like flying cars, personal flying cars, one for everyone in the family. Then we kind of had a taste of the future when we had things like the Concorde that let us zip around the world much faster than we even have today. And instead, the world that we're sort of facing and the future that's sort of being built for us and around us can be seen on the slightly grayer other side of the screen that I've got for you there, which is a futuristic kind of cyberpunk semi-dystopian Chinese city, which talks about such massively huge skyscrapers that no sunlight really comes in. And instead of a flying car, you've kind of got like a levered like bus that sort of like winches you up to your apartment. And I don't know about you, but that seems a whole lot less exciting than the sort of Jetsons view of the future we were brought up with. We were brought up to think that the future would be a continual progress for us and that our lives would be better, healthier, happier, and wealthier than those of our parents and grandparents. But for millions and millions of people across the world, young people, they are finding that they are actually less well off than their parents and grandparents' generations. In fact, they're saying that the Western millennial generation is the first Western democratic generation that is going to be financially worse off than their parents. So of course, that sets us up for quite some disappointments. And as we like to say, you know, happiness is the difference between your expectation of what your future is going to be and your reality. If you've got sort of an expectation deficit, then you end up being very, very resentful of what's going on in the world. And we've seen this through the protests going on. In fact, we've seen this week with what's going on with Reddit. Disenfranchised younger investors are literally taking over hedge funds and basically calling them up on their shorts and bankrupting even wealthier people who they feel are stealing their share of the future and our current prosperity. So we have to be very, very careful about the narratives that we tell, because we have to take two things into cognizance. We have to make sure that those narratives are, first of all, worth walking towards. So we have to have something to look forward to, because this is what humans need and desire as individuals to allow us to get through life and get up in the morning. But at the same time, those narratives have to be plausible. We have to believe that those things are possible. And when we kind of lose faith in the future, things become very, very difficult for us. And of course, this quote from Peter Thiel really just does rather just sum it up. We wanted flying cars, but instead we got 140 characters referring to sort of social media. And the fact that for many, many of us, in terms of the actual living standards that we have, perhaps they're not even all that different to what they were when we were children in the 80s and in the 90s. And in particular, we can look at the sort of white picket fence dream that a lot of us were sold as being the middle class project, the things we were supposed to look forward to. And in South Africa, we had the same promises that we promised younger generations that they were going to have what parents didn't have. You'd have your own house, you'd have your own car. But in reality, instead, what we're being offered is what you see on the screen, which is for me an entirely Western dystopia. This is an example of a company called Podshare based in Silicon Valley, where white-collar workers, that is young professionals, can rent a bunk bed. So you can see 6 bunk beds on the screen there behind me or next to me, depending on how you've set up your screen. And each one of those bunk beds, and look how tiny they are, rents for around about the equivalent of 12,000 Rand a month. This was not the middle class sort of lifestyle that we were promised. This was not the future that we thought we were working towards. And there are other sort of future narratives that are also raising a few eyebrows at the moment. So narratives like total prosperity for everyone. As Musa was talking about earlier, some of those prosperity narratives are directly opposed to the natural resource constraints we have in our society. And we're starting to also grapple with whether the techno-utopian visions that we've been sold by people in positions of power and people that control large parts of the world's wealth right now are actually utopias worth walking towards. So this, of course, is a screenshot from the famous movie WALL-E, where you had all the sort of fat human beings who didn't really move or were controlled by machines and just sort of spent all their time consuming virtual entertainment. Now, those sort of science fiction sort of dystopias are starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that leaves us stuck with what we're calling now postalgia, this uncomfortable feeling that today might be as good as it gets and that there's not really anything worth walking towards as a society or even as an individual. That's a really hopeless space to be in. And we're starting to see how this feeling is playing out in the real world. One of our favorite case studies at Flux Trends would be how this is playing out with the concept that we're terming the HIKIKOMORI, which is a Japanese term, and it refers to young people who have literally shut themselves away, become kind of hermits that stay in their apartments and shut themselves out from the world because they just feel like they have no role to play in the real world. And also they have nothing really to live for, which is obviously quite a disturbing concept of young people taking themselves out of the human story. But it's almost like a canary in the coal mine as to what's happening when positive and probable future narratives start to break down in our societies. And that brings me to what I'm talking to you about today, really, which is about this concept of narrative economics, which speaks about narratives as being a way of not just understanding or interpreting a situation, but also promoting a particular point of view or a set of values. And here we start to talk about how the stories that we tell each other about ourselves, about our businesses, about our societies can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And of course, one of the most famous narratives going on in the world right now would be that of Bitcoin, of course. And what you see on the charts over there is the Google trend chart, and the Google trend chart really looks at how many people have been searching for Bitcoin, and you can kind of see how that tracks over time very closely the price of Bitcoin itself, which is now trading, I think when I checked yesterday, at sort of 490,000 Rand for one Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is, of course, a virtual currency that is propped up by people believing in it, and people believe in it because of the stories that we tell each other that reinforce the value of these sorts of assets. That's just a nice example to show you how powerful the stories that we tell each other really are. And in terms of those stories, I think there's also quite a nice parallel as to what's gone on with epidemiologists, not just with economists lately, and how the stories that we tell each other with things like virus spreads are very similar to the way that memes, that is the stories we tell each other about societies and about assets and about what to buy and trade and sell next, tend to migrate in very, very similar ways. An idea that takes hold and spreads through society and actually changes society into its own image acts a lot like a physical virus. It acts in complicated, complex ways which make tracking how it's going to end up and how it's going to change society quite difficult. What we do know is that the smallest ideas tend to have the biggest impact in actually changing the world around us. So we have to be very careful about the stories that we tell each other about where we headed as society, about what we value and what we are going to invest. I'm not just talking about money here. I'm talking about investing our time and our energy in are going to be productive for our societies and for ourselves and not destructive. And of course, this becomes more important when you start to think about how in our digitally connected world, we are creating through our digital interactions, through the links that we click on, through the memes that we physically share through our social media platforms, what we term information cascades. So this is a sort of vicious or a virtuous circle where the winning ideas tend to take up a lot more of the narrative and the losing ideas don't. We've got another example here from the world of economics as to what happened with, say, the Tesla stock price this year. Everyone was talking about Tesla, so the Tesla stock price grew even more because it became part of popular consciousness, which attracted even more people to purchasing that one stock, till we got to the point where Elon Musk himself was saying, stop buying the company, it's getting totally overvalued right now. The same things can be seen through our Google search history and patterns, where we can see that websites or links that get attention get more attention, and things that don't get attention tend to fall below the fold, to use that marketing term, and out of consciousness. So what we're creating in a very virtual but also very globally digitally connected world is an opportunity for essentially rock star ideas to suck up far more than perhaps their sort of fair share of popular consciousness. And this is why simple ideas that are able to take hold, just like simple funny memes that are very easy to share and easy for people to get, tend to travel further. And when it comes to memes and ideas, the sort of information theory behind them says that a meme's entire purpose in life is to be shared as much as possible. That's not to say that it's necessarily the best ideas that get shared and start to change the world in their own image, but rather that the ideas that are the most powerful tend to be the most simple, which is a very interesting thing to look at, particularly when you can see how these sorts of information cascades and vicious and virtuous cycles of winning takes all ideas do tend to lead to things like bubbles, booms, and busts, and runs on the bank, like you can see on the screen in front of me. Or some of the crazy market moves that have been going on over the last few months as reality has become more and more untethered from the financial and virtualized stock markets that we play in. In fact, that was exactly the topic of my talk at this event last year, talking about that complete sort of decoupling of real value from virtual value and stock prices. We can see how we can get ourselves into quite dangerous situations if we are investing all of our time and our attention in ideas that aren't necessarily constructive to building a stable society, or constructive even just to our investment portfolios, if we want to use that example too. And I really just want to reiterate that point, that ideas do become self-fulfilling prophecies. And we can talk about this even in terms of brands. Like if you talk about your brand in a certain way, people start to associate your brand with the values that you speak about and with the values that you live out in the real world too. So we have to be really cognizant of that fact that economics does create the world it is investigating, and not just economics, also the narratives and stories that we tell, because they do influence prices, they influence behaviors in the real world. And that's something that us marketers tend to know very, very deeply, but perhaps it's taken economists slightly longer to catch on to these same trends, and the fact that narratives and the stories we tell are just so, so important. But when it comes to ideas recreating themselves or turning the real life into their own image, we have to be very, very careful that the ideas that we are adopting, that the ideas we allow to reshape our world, are constructive ideas. And as South Africans, we should all remember the Gupta Bal-Pottinger scandal of how fake news became real news and created real resentments and widened real divisions in real society, and how dangerous and destructive those sorts of divisive ideas really are. And that's just one example, because we're seeing a lot of this coming through from very powerful players, both sort of disingenuous, sort of almost online terrorist agencies, but also from legitimate governments starting to play in the space that we're terming meme warfare. And this is where governments engage in propaganda, I suppose you could call it, type campaigns designed to change behavior in the real world, but using digital tools, even down to literally cat memes to get people to sort of talk about certain issues and think about things in certain ways. And of course, these same tactics are used by sort of online trolls and groups to spread and sow disinformation and things like conspiracy. But this might sound a little bit abstract, but in the UK, they've got a military division known as the 77th Brigade, which is sort of colloquially known as the meme warfare division in the UK. And they are designed to do exactly that, to use sort of libertarian, paternalistic kind of nudge or behavioral economics techniques by engaging in meme warfare to change popular opinion on certain concepts, which is very, very interesting to think about, because propaganda campaigns of that scale were quite commonly known to be working between different countries. So say during the whole Cold War, both the US and Russia were engaging in dis and misinformation campaigns, which were termed at that time sort of Maskirovska campaigns, to actually sort of manipulate the politics of their enemies across the geopolitical ponds. But it's quite interesting now that we're starting to see nation states using these same techniques on their own populations. So we can kind of expect campaigns like this to be put into place to say encourage people to take vaccines, which we know is good for them. But using all these levers as to how we start to understand that information packaged in a right way can literally change the world and can change popular behavior on very deep-seated issues. Which brings me to the real question that I want to talk to you about today, and that is, what are the memes of the moment that are going to be changing our world as we go into the future? We've all heard about the sort of Build Back Better and the Great Reset campaign coming from powerful international and national leaders from all over the world. And the question is, do we support those narratives and those memes? And if we do we understand what they are asking of us? And if we don't like them, what alternative memes and narratives are we talking about amongst our own societies, amongst our own peer groups, to actually change the future? Because small ideas, well packaged, can spread incredibly quickly and change the real world really, really fast. And I think in particular, South Africans need to ask ourselves this question, because we all know about the sort of faded, broken rainbow nation metaphor and how cynical that has become, and how in fact insulting that narrative has become to so many young people, like I opened with today, who have ended up with a reality that is far below what they were expecting to get out of life in a free society in South Africa. The question for us, though, is to say, do we accept that defeat, or do we try to develop a new sort of narrative that is more inclusive, but that is also going to be practical and possible to actually work towards? Because that is what is required to start to rebuild a lot of the social contract cracks that I've been speaking about today, is to rebuild stories that we can all get behind, that we will all support, and that we can all actually believe in coming true. Because those stories that we tell do change the world that we're in. So to end with this quote over here, like I said, like a virus at the right time in the right place, given an accommodating host, a small idea can change the world. The question for you really is then, are we telling ourselves the right stories? Are we telling ourselves constructive stories that are going to make the world a better place, or destructive stories that could make things actually worse? And the good news, of course, is that there are some exciting stories back in play. We are starting to see the future is back in play right now. That if we are literally lifting our eyes to the skies, as both the private and the public sector are starting to get involved with exciting things like space exploration and even actual flying cars, I'm sure Dion will talk about a little later going forward. So if you found these ideas engaging, we would definitely like to invite you as Flux to play with the future and to play with future narratives with us. We've got new trend games that we're putting together, and Dion and I are always available on various different social media platforms if you ever want to chat to us about any of these sort of stories that are shaping our world going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bronwyn. And to everyone, I told you there's going to be some big ideas here. We've got time for just one question, and I'm going to actually, it's slightly off where you were going, but not quite. But it was something that was asked by Jane, presence really earlier on in the day, and because of your financial and economics background, and I thought this was, and especially with those narratives, it's been around a lot. So she's asking, what are your thoughts on introducing universal basic income, but specifically because of the job losses that we are going through now? Or do you have generic
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. For me, I find the concept of a universal basic income quite a low bar utopia to work towards, because it's essentially telling people that they're going to be unable to support themselves in the future, and that we have to sort of be accepting of accepting handouts in order for survival, which is once again not a narrative that's very inspirational for particularly for young people. At the same time, we do realize that we've got many people that are dependent on the state, in fact, many more than they were a year ago, due to all increased job losses and the more constrained economic conditions that we have. So there are things that have to be taken seriously. However, there's another problem here, which is really, where does the money come from to fund these sorts of systems? We know that our taxpayers are already overextended. We know we've already got one of the largest sort of grant welfare nets in the world. So in fact, we've kind of been engaged in a type of UBI trial program here in South Africa. And although it's helped people to stay alive, it hasn't necessarily solved deeper problems of things like inequality. So for me, what I've been encouraging people to look at for both sustainability purposes and also for aspirational and narrative purposes is to perhaps not just look at universal basic income, which is basically requiring more people to essentially become wards of the state, but to rather look towards what I'm terming open basic income projects, which is similar to universal basic income projects, but whereas a universal basic income project is applied to everyone, whether you opt in or not, an open basic income project is one that is opt-in and open to anyone who both needs to receive cash or wants to contribute to it. And we're seeing very interesting self-sustaining models being set up that don't require, forced taxation to do that redistribution, which is a worry for any of us, because we know how much money goes missing in the hands in the chain when it's being distributed via a central bureaucracy from one person to the next. And some of these open basic income projects actually tap into, for example, our own BBEE systems here in South Africa, where there are proposals that companies should contribute to an open basic income type fund that will then fund living wages, not just a 350 Rand grant, but more like a 3,000 Rands that have pay out every month for recipients. But in exchange, the companies that contribute to them should be able to claim those contributions as part of their BBE scorecard to say this is actually funding direct ownership in our company, because it's essentially a dividend that pays out on a monthly basis. And some of the calculations that have been looked at in those sorts of projects show that it could actually cost companies less than doing some of the other things on the BBE scorecards. If we're able to see regulators put those sort of self-sustaining sort of systems in place, we might be able to solve a lot of these problems with a lot more aspirational, lot more hopeful future stories going on behind them, because I am very, very concerned about low bar utopias that tell human beings they're not going to have a place to contribute value in society.
Great, thanks, Bronwyn. And Jane, you got your answer there, and I think you got more than you bargained for. But I think it just proves that the kind of narratives that we exploring today is just this kind of watershed moment from 2020, the year that was 2020, into the better normal, not the new normal, the better normal. There are a lot of options to do that. So thanks, Bronwyn, for that. I'm going to step back as your digital praise singer and then let you carry on to introduce our next guests. Thanks very much.